because we're going to get going. And of course, as tradition, we're going to have our speaker pull our first raffle ticket for the evening. But I do want to welcome everybody to the Frederick County Civil War Roundtable meeting here at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. And of course, we want to thank our ever so gracious hosts for having us here this evening. We've got a great turnout and a great speaker. But let's dive in with the raffle drawing, and then we will get on with our presentation. Okay. 5, got it. Go ahead and pull that first one.
I'll shake them up a little bit too.
Yeah.
Okay. There you go.
All righty. All righty. Our speaker has drawn the first ticket for the evening. The number is 713. 713. Got it? Hey, excellent. Good job. Now, just take her back there and grab a goodie. So
Matt, that's good. I wanted to make sure that wasn't my wife, that I didn't pick my own winner.
That's a good start. 709, 709. By all means. And we're drawing 5 of these tonight. 720. 720. Hey, there you go, Ed. Excellent. We got a few more here. 716. I'm all within the same range. 716. Did you get it again? It's up to you. You're welcome to pull again if you so wish. You're going to forego? Yeah. Okay, very good. Well, that's very nice of you. All righty. 711. Oh, thank heaven. 711. Anybody got that? Oh, how many tickets did you purchase? The Roundtable very much appreciates your donations. Were you 715 as well? We'll get all 3 members of the family? Now, everybody can see I am mixing these up. All righty. 718. That's a little bit higher. There we go. Excellent. And I think we've got one more. Ken, we got one more back there? Yes, sir. All right. 710. That's kind of close to what some of you... All right. Excellent. All right. Thank you very much, everybody, for participating in the raffle. Tonight we have... Yes, tonight we're going to have Bob make a quick announcement.
For today only, Sappis Beatty, the premier publisher of Civil War books recently, has 2 of their books available as e-books on sale for only $3.99. They are If We Are Striking for Pennsylvania, the new book that just came out by Wittenberg and Scott Mingus about the campaign into Gettysburg, and also The Battle of Jackson by Chris
Makowski. Yep.
Both of them, you go to their website, find the book, and you have to look for the e-book. And click that, it sends you out to Amazon. Yeah, I know. But for $3.99 e-books, I'll take it.
There you go.
But if you're interested, I mean, I usually buy the e-book and the hardback. But I like reading e-books anymore. But those 2 are deals.
Can't beat it.
Can't beat it.
Right.
So it's today only. So.
Right. Thank you, Bob. Tonight, our speaker, ladies and gentlemen, is Tom McMillan, and he is a longtime volunteer in a number of national park sites, researcher and historian on numerous topics, not only the Civil War, but also numerous works on Flight 93. I don't want to get too far into the details on his background because I want him to come on up and actually give the presentation. So let's everyone welcome Tom McMillan to the floor.
Thank you, sir.
Absolutely.
That was the best introduction ever. Thank you. Good to see some old friends and hopefully make some new ones. As you can probably tell, this group particular, from the title of this book and this talk, this all kind of stems from the movie Gettysburg. And I look at one of the legends of that movie. It's had such an impact, and I examine it and challenge it and hopefully correct some of it. But I feel like I always should start by saying, despite all that, I love the movie Gettysburg. I mean, it's what got me reinterested in studying the battle as an adult. I grew up in Pittsburgh, so Pennsylvania, it's a rite of passage. Your parents take you to Gettysburg when you're a little kid. History, but it's probably happened to some of you. Life sometimes gets in the way, job and family, and you move on, you're doing other things. Movie comes out in 1993. I see it at a theater in Pittsburgh on a Tuesday night. I drove to Gettysburg 3 days later. I was driving down Confederate Avenue. I looked across the field at Pickett's Charge. Music was playing in my head, and I've had the illness ever since. Going back 29 years. And Matt, thank you for scheduling this when you did, because it's right next to Remembrance Weekend, so we're going right up there tomorrow. We'll spend some time in Gettysburg, so thank you. Some of you may be up there as well. But I realized later that I did it backwards from a lot of people, and that I watched the movie before I read the novel it was based on, Killer Angels, which had won the Pulitzer Prize for fiction all the way back in 1975. And as I keep having to tell my Gettysburg friends, the key phrase there is not Pulitzer Prize. The key phrase is for fiction. For fiction. The novel and the movie are based on a foundation of history, of course, we all know that, but there's a lot of fiction involved, especially with the conversations. And the novelist, Michael Shara, does it so well that you can't figure out the difference. You can't, what's fact or what's fiction. And it really impacts the way we look at some of these stories, especially when you see them on the screen. So many great stories. But the one that always stood out to me was the story of Lewis Armistead and Winfield Scott Hancock. And especially as Shara told it, what a story that was. Two friends, almost brothers, served together in the U.S. Army, torn apart by the Civil War, have this, as we know, a teary-eyed farewell out in California. And then they meet 2 years later in the most famous attack of the war, Pickett's Charge at Gettysburg, where Armistead's men directly attack Hancock's men and both fall wounded. I mean, you couldn't make all of that up if possible. Doing my research, just as a student of history, student of the battle, I wanted to read a book on Armistead and Hancock, and was stunned to find out there wasn't one. Left an opening for this one, but with the Civil War scholar Ethan Rafuse, who I don't know, but know of him, he reviewed my book for Civil War Times, and he said, I can't believe it took 30 years for somebody to do a book on this, but it did leave an opening for me. So back then when I'm starting to read and study, I figured, well, I'll read about Lewis Armistead. There has to be a lot written about the Civil War general who achieved the deepest penetration into the angle at Pickett's Charge. There's even a monument there. It says Armistead fell here. 159 years, there is one book written about Lewis Armistead. This is it. About 64 pages of text. You know, it's done by Wayne Motts, the name many of you would know, legendary Gettysburg guide, president of the Gettysburg Foundation. So it's well researched, well done. But that is it on Lewis Armistead. There is, by contrast, a lot written on Hancock. I mean, he was a hero of the battle. He lives for 20 years after the war. He runs for president in 1880. A lot of books starting late 19th century. Up to a couple years ago, there was another book on Hancock. Most of them barely mention Armistead. Some don't mention him at all. You're like, what's going on here with this story? I started my research. I did it by talking to a bunch of my Gettysburg Civil War nerd friends, and I include us all in that category. I'm one of them. But I wanted to see what do you know about the story of Armistead and Hancock? And almost to a person, what they knew came from 3 scenes from the movie Gettysburg. Led by the scenes where Armistead is talking to James Longstreet on the eve of battle. And he's talking about Armistead, he's talking about Hancock, and he's talking about the farewell out in California. I'll get this going. He says, at one point, talking about the farewell, he quotes himself, and this is one of the great scenes in the movie. If this would work, it doesn't work. It's on. It's even on. Can we take a break? No. Technology, you know. There we go.
But are you clicking through it or dying?
I got it. So as I was saying, one of the great scenes of the movie, he says, "When, so help me, if I ever raise my hand against you, may God strike me dead." May God strike me dead. I mean, Lewis Armistead's a hard-nosed soldier. Here they're trying to get us to believe that he's thinking he can't think even about killing Hancock, even though they're going to fight in this. It just didn't make any sense. But that's the that's the novel version. That's the movie version. There was only one person at that farewell party who ever wrote about it, and that was Hancock's wife, Elmira. And she did quote Armistead as saying, "May God strike me dead," but it was in a slightly different context. What she said is, "I hope God will strike me dead if I'm ever induced to leave my native soil should worst come to worst." And I got my Gettysburg nerd friends together and I read this to them and they said, that can't be right. That's not very compelling. So how's this happen? Well, it's a tool that novelists and movie makers use. I mean, they're going to draw you into the story. They'll enhance the story. They'll enhance quotes. And sometimes they make some of them up. And it's not a criticism because Michael Shara never said he was writing a scholarly history of the Battle of Gettysburg. And the movie makers never said they were doing a documentary. They were doing a Hollywood film. So shame on us for thinking it was all true. And by the way, that great scene, those great conversations between Armistead and Longstreet never happened. Totally made up. So next we go on to, okay, people will say, what about West Point? You're going to write about them at West Point. They went to West Point together, right? They did not go to West Point together. Armistead's the older man by 7 years. Armistead born 1817, Hancock born 1824. Lewis Armistead was, through his escapades at West Point, serving in the Army in a war down in Florida, the Second Seminole War, before Winnie Hancock even enrolled at West Point. They meet later on the frontier. Next step, what letters, personal letters between these two almost brothers? None exist. There are no letters from Armistead that even mention Hancock. There are 2 letters from Hancock that mention Armistead, but they're written years after the battle, after he's dead, and he's merely inquiring about the circumstances of Armistead's wounding. So you're saying, again, what gives here? And I think that, I don't want to say a lack of evidence, but lack of accessible evidence has led a lot of people to question this story, question the depth of the friendship. Were they friends at all? Did Elmira Hancock make this all up? Well, standing in front of you with a subtitle of a book that calls them friends, I think you can conclude that I concluded they were friends. I'm confident in saying they were pretty good friends. They were not almost brothers. They weren't even best friends in the modern sense in that they spent so much time away from each other. But they served together on the frontier. They served together in combat in the Mexican War. They built that bond as soldiers, and that bond lasted 19 years until they met in the fields of Pickett's Charge. So to me, the real story of Armistead and Hancock is unique and compelling and really reflective of what the Civil War did to the country on a personal level. It's just not the same story that we heard and loved from the novel and the movie. So who were these guys individually? Lewis Addison Armistead came from a very distinguished military family from Virginia. Armistead men had been serving in some sort of the American military since the year 1680, when Lewis's 3rd great-grandfather was Lieutenant Colonel of the Horse Militia in Gloucester County, Virginia. They served in all the American wars, all the early wars, and Lewis's father and 3 of his uncles were professional U.S. Army officers in the War of 1812. 4 brothers from the same family and a generation just ahead of his. So the family's always intrigued me. We'll go through that roster a little bit, the 1812. Captain Lewis, G.A. Armistead, the original Lewis Armistead. G.A. stands for Gustavus Adolphus. He's named for the famed 17th century Swedish warrior. He commands a rifle unit. He's killed in action by the British at the Battle of Fort Erie in 1814. Captain Addison Armistead commands coastal fortifications in South Carolina. He dies of disease while on duty in 1813. So look at those names, Lewis and Addison. Lewis and Addison. What's our Civil War guy's name? Lewis Addison Armistead. He's the 2 uncles who gave their lives in the War of 1812. He's the kid's military almost from the time he comes out of the womb. But the most famous brothers of the uncles is the 3rd one, Lieutenant Colonel George Armistead, who defended Fort McHenry in the Battle of Baltimore when Francis Scott Key wrote the national anthem. Not only that, but George took the flag, the original Star-Spangled Banner. He took it off the flagpole, took it home, in complete violation of Army regulations, basically stole the flag. It remained in the private possession of the Armistead family for 90 years until George's grandson gave it to the Smithsonian in 1907. So if you would go to the Smithsonian tomorrow, National Museum of American History, go to the 2nd floor, Star-Spangled Banner display, go into that dark chamber, see that thin wisp of a 200-year-old flag, came directly out of the Armistead family, one of the most iconic pieces of American history. And by the way, that's the topic of my next book, which comes out in June. So. My editor's here tonight, so I thought I'd better say that. But no, really, I've done a lot of research on the Armistead family. But George is not all that famous, in part because he dies in 1818, only a few years after the war. So the longest living and therefore highest ranking of the Armistead brothers is Lewis's father, Walker Keith Armistead. Not very well known today, very well known, very prominent in his era. Third man ever to graduate from West Point. In 1818, when Lewis is 1 year old, Walker's named chief engineer of the U.S. Army. All those engineering graduates from West Point, he's the chief engineer. 1828, Lewis is 11. Walker's promoted to brigadier general, one of the highest ranking officers in the Army. So folks, it is no coincidence that Lewis Armistead became a soldier. It's no coincidence that his three younger brothers were all Confederate soldiers and fought in the Civil War, something I had never heard before I started doing this research. No coincidence that his only surviving son, also named Walker Keith, was on his staff as a teenager at the Battle of Gettysburg, an eyewitness to Pickett's charge. Military service is part of the Armistead DNA for centuries. Now Lewis, our Lewis, wants to follow his father's footsteps, wants to go to West Point. He gets an appointment in 1833. That's not very hard when your dad's a brigadier general, but it is probably the most storied career of anyone who never graduated. 3 years on campus, never got out of the freshman class. That's hard to do if you tried. Sick a little bit, obviously not a very good student. Gets in a fair amount of trouble. But in his third year on campus, 1835-36, he's taking the same classes for the third time. He's all the way up to the middle of the academic rankings, which should tell you something. There's this entry in January of his West Point records. Cadet Armistead is hereby placed in arrest, charged with disorderly conduct in the mess hall on the 16th, limits his room. Okay, now no one knows what really happened because there was a fire at West Point before the Civil War. Lots of records were burned. But as you have probably heard, the story that made its way through the Confederate Army was that Armistead got in a mess hall brawl with another future Confederate general, Jubal Early, and hit him over the head with a plate. And for any of us who have studied Jubal Early, you know there are a lot of people who probably wanted to hit him over the head with a plate. But as much as we laugh, and I laugh, and we smirk, it was serious back then. And Lewis is talking to his father, and they think the only way to avoid a court-martial is for him to resign. So he writes a letter of resignation. And there's no guarantee it's going to be accepted, but the superintendent of West Point writes a letter to the Secretary of War. We hope it will be accepted as a courtesy to Brigadier General Walker Keith Armistead. So Lewis is allowed to resign as a courtesy to his father, avoids a court-martial. There's about a 3-year gap in the history of his life. Not much appears again until the summer of 1839, July of 1839, when he gets a commission as a civilian, as a second lieutenant in the U.S. Army. There's a war going on down in Florida, the Second Seminole War. They need officers. The Armistead name still means something. Lewis at least went to West Point. So he gets in. His last class at West Point graduated July 1st, 1839. Their commissions date to that day. Lewis's commission dates July 10th. All those shenanigans, resigned, not even on campus the last 3 years, all he loses is 9 days in rank. It's good to know people in high places then as now. Your dad's a brigadier general, your uncle's a U.S. congressman, you're in the Army. Thank you, pal. Off he goes to service right away. It's a rude introduction to life in the Army. Second or third day down in Florida, he's in a hot firefight with the Seminoles. But not much into his tenure, the Army, as it did often at that time, especially during that war, made a change in its command structure. Who's the new commander of all U.S. troops in the Florida theater? Brigadier General Walker Keith Armistead. So Lewis is added to his staff as an aide. His experience in Florida changes dramatically, but he does at least get to see how an army is operated up close, so there's some value there. And he finishes out his term. Early 1840s, he is sent to Fort Towson in the Indian Territory of what is now Oklahoma. And that is where, in 1844, he will meet a young man named Winfield Scott Hancock. And now for Hancock's story. He doesn't have the military pedigree of the Armisteads. No one would at this point. But he did have a father who had a thing for historic names. And no wonder his father's name was Benjamin Franklin Hancock. So Benjamin Franklin Hancock and his wife have twin boys in 1824. They named one Winfield Scott after the famed soldier of the era. They named the other one Hillary Baker, which meant absolutely nothing to me, but these folks, I looked it up, these folks are from southeastern PA. Hillary Baker had been mayor of Philadelphia. He'd fought in the Revolution. He was a locally prominent name at the time. 6 years later, they have a third son. They name him simply John Hancock. John Hancock is with his brother Winfield as a staff officer at the Battle of Gettysburg. So both Armistead and Hancock have immediate family members with them at the battle. Now, Hancock is an impressive young man growing up in Norristown, Pennsylvania. He gets an appointment to West Point at age 16. His father's not sure it's such a good idea. Not only is he young, 16 is the youngest age you can get in at that point, but he's small. We have this image, we've always been told, of the big strapping Winfield Scott Hancock, right? Big guy, dominating figure. How tall he was when he entered West Point? 5 feet, 5 inches tall. One of his fellow classmates, years later after they were generals, wrote that first year they considered Hancock their pet. The great Winfield Scott Hancock was their pet. He does grow, he is a growth spurt. He grows about 7 inches. He's 6 feet tall by the time he leaves West Point, but he's small early, and it's a boys' school. He gets picked on, he gets bullied, and at one point it gets so bad that one of his larger classmates has to step in and fight one of the bullies on Hancock's behalf. And that classmate is none other than Alexander Hayes, who commands a division under Hancock and Pickett's charge. Relationships are rather amazing. As the story goes, he met the bully behind one of the monuments. It's knocked down, dragged out. Hayes is declared the winner because he's the only one who can get up when it's over. And often, as all of us who study the war know, these things can be apocryphal. If you make them up, they sound good. But Hancock references this later in his life. He says, when I was a boy, I once had a difficulty, and Alexander Hayes was the first to volunteer to assist me. And in extracting me from my trouble, became involved in aforesaid difficulty himself. I never forgot his generous action. And these two guys do have long-standing relationships. Now, Hancock is not a very good student either. Unlike Armistead, he does graduate. He's 18th out of 25 in the class of 1844. Late in his senior year, the great Winfield Scott does come to campus. He wants to seek out his young namesake. And there's another story, which I'm sure is apocryphal, that Hancock asked to be sent to the regiment farthest on the frontier. What happened was he did get sent to the regiment farthest on the frontier, to Fort Towson in the Indian Territory of Oklahoma. And that is where in October of 1844, we have the first Army record of Armistead and Hancock being together. They're a small officer corps in this really remote post. I mean, it's on the edge of Texas, which at the time was a republic. It's as far west as you could get and still be in the United States. They would serve together for 16 months on the frontier. In 1845, they were transferred together to another remote Oklahoma post, Fort Washita, where there were only 6 officers. Here is one of the monthly returns, 6 officers and a chaplain. Armistead is listed 3rd, Hancock is listed 6th. So did they know each other? Of course they did. This is where the bond was really developed. They almost certainly would have lived in the same officer's hut. It's also the only time period where we have a piece of evidence that's not a U.S. Army record of Armistead and Hancock being in the same place at the same time. This is a letter that Armistead wrote, a mundane letter he wrote to a fellow soldier that year. And Armistead has beautiful handwriting, and there you see at the bottom, L.A. Armistead. Next page, who signs the P.S.? W. Hancock. Those guys obviously were friends. They obviously were living together and working together. So is it an earth-shattering piece of evidence? No, but it's just kind of cool to see they both signed the same document. So they certainly are friends. They're working together and having a good time together. Now, 1846 comes along. War with Mexico. These guys want to go. All the young soldiers want to go. They serve together in the 6th U.S. Infantry, same regiment. They fought in some of the same battles, both breveted for gallantry. We know a little bit more about Armistead because he's an older man, slightly higher ranking. He's in more detail. And this is the time when you start to see other soldiers writing about Armistead and talking about how brave he was. It was a theme throughout his career. He may not have been the best officer, certainly wasn't a great strategist, but he was very brave. You would always read the gallant Armistead. And he was the first U.S. officer into the ditch, leading the way on the final attack on Chapultepec Castle. So his fellow soldiers really looked up to him for that. Now, for several months after the war, from the time the last shots were fired until the peace treaty was signed, the U.S. Army occupied Mexico. Armistead commanded a small company. His lieutenants were Hancock and another name probably familiar to you, Henry Heath, a young man just arrived from West Point. Heath, writing his memoirs decades later, gives us third-person confirmation of the friendship. He writes, Armistead, Hancock, and I were messmates, and never was a mess happier than ours. So these guys, again, long before the Civil War, they're working together. Now, Heath and Hancock are about the same age. Armistead's older. Heath and Hancock are single. Armistead's married. There's no combat. This is an occupation period. Heath and Hancock are going out almost every night looking for a nightlife, trying to meet young ladies. Heath writes about this a lot in his memoirs. He says Hancock's so good looking, he's like a magnet for the young ladies. And even poor Heath gets to meet a couple. But one night Heath writes and he says, Hancock's telling a girl, I love you. Next night, a second one, I love you. Next night, a third one, I love you. And Heath writes, I said, Hancock, how can you keep telling different women you love them? Hancock says, Heath, we're still at war, and all is fair in love and war. I mean, good time. Now, they get transferred together after the peace treaty is signed to Jefferson Barracks in St. Louis, and the same thing happens. They're going out in the town, and Heath is with him when Hancock meets his future wife, Elmira Russell. You can make a case that Hancock was closer to Heath than he was to Armistead, certainly socially. But the book isn't Heath and Hancock. Michael Shar didn't write about that. It's Armistead and Hancock, so we'll get back to our story. What kind of personal life, family lives did these guys have? We often don't get into that. Winfield Scott Hancock had about as stable a family life as you could have while being an Army officer in the 19th century. He and Elmira had 2 children, boy and a girl. Family is almost always together. Hancock's down in Florida, they're with him. Hancock's in Los Angeles, they're with him. And they remained married until Hancock's death in 1886. Armistead, by contrast, has a very, very tragic personal life. Between 1850 and 1855, he loses 2 wives and 2 of his 3 children to disease on the frontier. What would that have done to you? It's tough not losing one person that close. He loses 4 in 5 years. And you see soldiers writing about it. He becomes bitter. He becomes sullen. Naturally he would. He changed. So I pointed out because the Armistead figure, the happy-go-lucky Armistead figure you see in the movie Gettysburg, that's not the way he would have been at that point in his life. He was dealt a different hand of cards. So in the 13-year period between the end of the Mexican War and the beginning of the Civil War, 1848 to 1861, Armistead and Hancock are almost never together. There is one point in the late 1850s where the 6th Infantry gets together and makes a legendary 1,000-mile march to the West Coast. So they're together for a few months, catching up, telling stories. You get out west, they're split up again. Armistead is sent to the Indian Territory of what is now Arizona to deal with some Mojave Indians who are harassing settlers. And Hancock, who was a quartermaster for most of his pre-Civil War career, is sent to the quaint West Coast town of Los Angeles, California, population barely 4,000. And one of his duties is to supply Armistead's troops. So one thing about, if any of you have done research, you can find a lot about soldiers in U.S. Army records, which are great, but also newspapers. The newspaper reporters in this era love to write about the Army. The problem with this for researchers is it's painstaking. It takes a lot of patience. I have 0 patience. I have negative patience. Fortunately, my wife Colleen, who's here tonight, has a lot of patience and likes to research, so she'll say, give me the assignment. So one day I said, okay, in 1859, Armistead and Hancock, Los Angeles, can you find anything? Literally 20 minutes later, she says, how about this? Extra, outbreak of the Mojave Indians. An express arrived last night from Major Armistead at Beale's Crossing of the Colorado to Captain Hancock, at present residing here, conveying intelligence, on and on and on. So, again, not earth-shattering evidence, but it's cool because it mentions both of their names. I've never seen this referenced before. It shows that even though they're hundreds of miles apart, the bond is continuing. They're working together. So Armistead does a pretty good job. He wins his battle with Mojaves. He earns a well-deserved leave of absence. Being the son of a late brigadier general, he knows how to work the system. He turns it into an almost year-long leave of absence. He spends almost the entire year of 1860 back home in Virginia. He's even listed in the county census as though he lived there. He gets to reconnect with his elderly mother, with his teenage son Walker Keith, and with some neighbors, including the man who lived on the farmer plantation nearby, the future Confederate Cavalier, Turner Ashby, who at the time was running a local militia unit. They'd been called in for the John Brown raid in 1859. Ashby was there when Brown was hanged. So Ashby has a sense of what's going on. He thinks there might be a civil war coming. He's telling Armistead this. Armistead's been away for so long he can't get his arms around it. He says, Turner, do not talk so. Let me sing you a song and wipe away your gloom. And with that, Lewis Armistead started to sing the Star-Spangled Banner. And according to Ashby's biographer, Ashby joined in heartily. So there you have 9 months before the Civil War, 2 future Confederate generals singing the Star-Spangled Banner on Ashby's porch. I mean, think about what the Civil War did to the country. That's a scene right there. Now, Armistead can't stay east forever. He eventually has to get back to his duty. His new assignment is in San Diego, California, just 120 miles south of where Hancock is in LA. He gets there late December 1860. By that point, South Carolina has seceded. Others are lining up to secede. Early 1861, Mrs. Hancock writes that a lot of the Southern-born officers in the Army out west were going to Hancock to ask him for advice. What should we do? Hancock, well-respected officer. Hancock didn't have much advice. He said, I can give you no advice, as I shall not fight upon this principle of state rights, but for the Union, whole and undivided, I cannot sympathize with you. You must be guided by your own convictions, and I hope you will make no mistakes. This is an easy decision for Hancock. Yes, he's a Northerner, obviously, but he's 100% a Union man. He's not an abolitionist. Winfield Scott Hancock is not an abolitionist. He's a conservative Democrat. The parties were different back then, but he's 100% a Union man. He wants to keep the Union together. It is a very difficult decision for Lewis Armistead. You might say, how's that? I mean, he's a native Southerner. He comes from a long line of slaveholders. He grew up on a farm with 19 slaves. He owned at least 1 slave, maybe 2 for a time himself. He believes in the Southern cause and the Southern way of life. But his whole history and his family's history is wrapped up in the U.S. Army and the Star-Spangled Banner. So he does struggle with this. And as we know, he does choose the Confederacy. And even for a man, there aren't many letters. We don't have much of evidence of what he wrote. But I did find a letter where he explained why he did this. It was something I found in a letter in his son's military records in the National Archives. Armistead is writing in December of 1861, trying to get his son into a Confederate officer training program. And this is the letter, again, showing, again, the beautiful writing, December 2nd, 1861. But this is the key part. I've been a soldier all my life. I was an officer in the Army of the U.S., which service I left to fight for my own country and for and with my own people, and because they were right and oppressed. For my own country and for and with my own people. That's why Lewis Armistead fought for the Confederacy. Which brings us to the famous farewell gathering. Lots of questions about this. Did Elmira Hancock get the date right? Did she get the guest list right? Did it happen at all? You could find in chat room discussion groups it didn't happen at all. They weren't together. I think something did happen, but when you look at it, you have to say, okay, who did she say she was there? Who did she identify was there? And were they in the same place? Were they in Los Angeles at this time period? Late spring, early summer of 1861. If you read her account closely, she only identifies 3 people by name who were there. She says more were there, but only 3 by name. Armistead and Hancock, obviously, and Albert Sidney Johnston. So were all those 3 together in Los Angeles at some time during this time period? Yes. Hancock and Johnston lived in Los Angeles. Their families were friends. They got together all the time. We have evidence that Armistead was through LA at least twice in May for 3-day periods. It's in the newspapers, prominent enough for the reporters to see him. We know from a letter he was there in later June. So those are 3 pieces of evidence we have that he was there. He could have been there other times. So I think there's enough evidence that something did happen here. It certainly was possible that they were together. So to her account, because not many people have read the Michael Shaw account or watched the movie and not really read her account, what did she say? This is it. It was emotional. The most crushed of the party was Major Armistead, who with tears which were contagious streaming down his face and hands upon Mr. Hancock's shoulders while looking him steadily in the eye, said, Hancock, goodbye. You can never know what this has cost me, and I hope God will strike me dead if I'm ever induced to leave my native soil, should worst come to worst. She goes on to write other things, however. She says that Armistead actually brought along his U.S. Army Major's uniform to give to Hancock in case Hancock might sometime need it. Hancock's only a captain. I'm leaving the Army, buddy. You want my uniform? Here. And he also gives to Elmira a satchel, and I'll quote her here, requesting it should not be opened except in the event of his death, in which case the souvenirs it contained, with the exception of the little prayer book intended for me and which I still possess should be sent to his family. On the flyleaf of this book is the following: Louis A. Armistead, trust in God and fear nothing. So unlike the movie, he did not give this to Longstreet in a tent on the eve of the Battle of Gettysburg. He gave it to Elmira Hancock in California before they left. Now, if hers was the only account of this gathering, we could really question it, because one person can say anything. I did find another obscure account in an obscure book on Hancock written in 1880 when he was running for president. It's written by the Reverend D.X. Junkin, who I thought would be credible because he was a reverend. He was former chaplain of the U.S. Navy. He was a friend of the Hancock family. He did part of the work on the book in the Hancock home with Winfield looking over his shoulder. This next passage I'm going to show you, he attributed to Hancock. He does not quote him. I wish he had quoted him directly, but he said he attributes it. He says, an interesting incident in connection with General Armistead's defection from the United States Army is related by General Hancock. It occurred in Los Angeles early in 1861. On leaving Los Angeles, he presented Hancock with his major's uniform, and the latter might sometime need it. This is 7 years before Mrs. Hancock's book. He also goes on to say something else very similar. I won't read the whole thing, but he, again, placed some certain valuable papers on the flyleaf of the book is the following: Louis A. Armistead, trust in God and fear nothing. So Winfield and Elmira are telling the same story. The only discrepancy is who got the prayer book. He says he got it, she says she got it. Somebody got the damn prayer book. But that's, so I think we can be assured. It might have been exactly the way she described it, but something happened there. So they come east. First 2 years of the war, they do not meet on the battlefield. There are a couple of the same battles that are both at the 7 days. They're both in Antietam. They're actually pretty close physically at Antietam. It's not until the third day at Gettysburg. And so the question we get, and guides get, and rangers get, did they know they were facing each other? And the best answer is probably. I mean, that's all we can know. But in the third day of a battle in the same place, Army intelligence would have been pretty good. 2 days of prisoners, battle flags. Confederates certainly would have known they were going up against Hancock and the Second Corps on that same field the previous day. But the cogent point here is they weren't talking about facing each other. They weren't longing for one another. Oh, Winnie boy. Oh, Lo. And always the least popular point of my talks is when I say, folks, I'm not even sure Lo was Armistead's nickname. There is very scant evidence for that. It's not central to the story, so I wrote about it in an appendix. If you want to get into it, you can read it. It doesn't really matter, but I titled the appendix Lo and Behold. So it was to amuse myself. But fast here, as you know, Armistead leads about 100 men over the wall at the angle. And this is the monument that we've all seen, put up in the 1880s, the Armistead Fell Here monument. Want to see what that looked like about 100 years ago? Look at all the growth around the angle, the different transportation. You may know that if you're at Gettysburg now when it's dry, you can still see the outline of that road, but they certainly didn't move the monument, so there it is as we have it today. Other question we all get, is it accurately placed? And I often see people shaking their heads, no. The answer really is who knows. But whatever your theory is, you can find an eyewitness account. There are eyewitness accounts who say he was hit as soon as he crossed the wall, fell there, end of story. There's one really detailed account from a man in his brigade who said he was hit when he crossed the wall and staggered forward to the second line of guns where he was hit again and fell. And there are multiple accounts, Union and Confederate, that he stormed past the wall up to the second line of guns where he was hit twice and fell. The most credible of these came from, I think, the Union commander at the wall, Alexander Webb of the Philadelphia Brigade, who he wrote, he wouldn't have been, I think, in a position, he wouldn't want to give Armistead credit for anything he didn't really achieve. And Webb wrote a letter to his wife 3 days after the battle, July 6, 1863, long before anyone is spinning about what happened here. And what he said was, General Armistead, an old Army officer, came over my fence and passed me with 4 of his men. So I think that's probably the truth. Armistead probably passed him and get up. Where the second line of guns was exactly, who knows? But it's probably somewhere in the vicinity of where the monument is. And we also all know the stories of Armistead being attended to by Union soldiers. And these all have Masonic implications. Louis A. Armistead, proud member of the Masons. The first one is that he used a coded Masonic phrase for distress, something, I'm a son of a widow, and Union soldiers who were brother Masons heard this and rushed forward and carried him off the battlefield. I'm a little bit of a cynic. There are enough accounts of this that it probably happened, but folks, there is no way the Union Army is letting a wounded Confederate general just lay there, even if they pick him up just for intelligence purposes, if not for respect of a general. So I think Armistead's going to be carried off whether he's a Mason or not. The other one is his encounter with a Union staff officer named Henry Bingham, who of course is on Hancock's staff. And Bingham's a Mason, Armistead's a Mason, Hancock's a Mason. As a result, we have the very beautiful friend-to-friend Masonic Memorial, one of the great memorials in the battlefield, at the entrance to the cemetery annex. The Masons originally wanted this to be Armistead and Hancock shaking hands. The park rejected that, but this did happen. Bingham did come up and talk to Armistead, but I was really stunned when I looked. I could find no evidence anywhere that this happened because of a Masonic connection, that was the motivation. Very well may have. There's just no evidence. The only two who know are Armistead and Bingham. Armistead died 2 days later. Bingham only wrote about it twice in his life. I know it's a secretive organization, but these were private letters to his fellow Mason Hancock. Never mentioned it. There's no other account. Secondary, Bingham told me. So again, it might be true. I can't prove it wasn't, but I was just surprised that it's become such an accepted story and there's no evidence to it. In fact, if you read Bingham's account, his full account, he knows he's coming over to attend to a Confederate general who's wounded. He thinks it's James Longstreet. He's told he's coming to help James Longstreet, who is not a Mason. He's going to help him anyway. He doesn't find it's Armistead until he gets there. And they're talking, and they identify each other. And Armistead hears Hancock's staff. He says, Winfield Scott Hancock, yes. Identifies him as an old and valued friend. And then he gives Bingham a quote that's controversial still to this day. Bingham writes a letter to Hancock a few years later, quoting Armistead, I've done him and done you all an injury which I so regret or repent, I forget the exact word, the longest day I live. It's led people still today think Armistead was recanting. Folks, everything I know about Lewis Armistead before this, and even a few things he said afterwards, he was not going to recant. Whatever you think of him, he was a proud Confederate soldier. Now, he is carried to the George Spangler farm nearby, and if you haven't been there, the Gettysburg Foundation's done a great job. We were talking a little bit before this, refurbishing that as what a Civil War hospital would have looked like. Union doctors don't think his wounds are fatal. They are astonished when he dies 2 days later. They don't know much about germs, obviously. There's some theory that there might have been a wound that they missed. I doubt that happened. Most of the medical people that Wayne Mott's talked to and that I talked to think, and I'm a layman here, but talking about a pulmonary embolism, that it was his leg wound, that it was a clot that formed in his leg and went into his lungs. It would have killed him very quickly. Whatever the reason, he dies on July 5th. He is buried in a shallow grave on the Spangler farm. Story would have ended there except for a cold-hearted Gettysburg doctor who wants to dig him up and embalm him because he thinks the Armistead family relatives will pay for the body. And he's correct. I run some correspondence between the doctor's friend and Lewis's first cousin down in Baltimore, Christopher Hughes Armistead, the son of the hero of Fort McHenry, who wants the body. A couple letters back and forth. October, $100. Christopher pays the money. Body's sent to Christopher down in Baltimore. He takes it to Old St. Paul Cemetery and buries Armistead in the same family vault as his famous uncle, George Armistead, the hero of Fort McHenry. Always been a little mystery about this. I was on a Ranger talk at Gettysburg only a few years ago where they said, we know Armistead is in Old St. Paul's. Not exactly sure where. That's where. Nameplates, side by side. George Armistead, Lewis Armistead. It is pretty much a private cemetery now. It's gated and locked. You can get in on occasion. For tours, we were able to finagle our way in, and while I gawked at this, Colleen had the presence of mind to take the photo, so we have that here to show you. So interesting. That's the wrap-up of the Armistead story. Now, Hancock, a lot more known about him. It really is eerie that he was wounded at about the same time, almost on a straight line on Seminary Ridge, just a few hundred yards away. And we know about the wound, it took a long time to heal. In fact, it never completely healed. He returns to the Army 6 months later, had a pretty good day at Spotsylvania, continues to serve, but he never got his physical capacity back, and I think he was probably on track to get independent command. I think this prevented him from that. But he did stay in the Army. The rest of his life had a really interesting post-Army career. He oversaw the execution of the Lincoln conspirators. He fought Indians in Kansas. He was briefly the controversial military governor of Louisiana, where he got in a huge spat with Ulysses S. Grant. And he ran for president 3 times. He was a nominee once. He was a Democratic nominee in 1880, but he was in the mix in 1868 when he would have run against Grant, which would have been interesting. He was almost a vice presidential nominee in 1876. He gets the nomination in 1880. This was a very close election to James Garfield. Retires from public life at that point. Visits Gettysburg for the final time in 1885, where he famously argues with the historian John Batchelder on the proposed location of the Hancock Wounding Monument. There it is, put up after his death. There was a stake in the ground. Hancock thought it should be much closer to the angle. Batchelder, just as stubborn, wouldn't give in. Certainly nobody's questioning the courage of Winfield Scott Hancock. So it's probably somewhere where he was hit. But the next day, despite their argument, he did take Batchelder and some other dignitaries on a tour of the battlefield. How cool would it have been 22 years after the battle to walk and ride the field with Winfield Scott Hancock? What a gift to history that was. And it's a good thing it happened because a few months later, February 1886, he contracts an illness and he dies. And he's buried in a vault in Norristown, Pennsylvania that he built when his daughter died as a teenager. Hancock and his daughter are buried there. Life goes on. His wife and son are buried somewhere else. Now, the Armistead Hancock story wasn't well known or talked about much 19th century. It wasn't talked about at all in the early 20th century. It had faded into oblivion. It wasn't until the 1950s when the famed Civil War historian Bruce Catton, in his book Glory Road, wrote about the friendship, using for the first time Elmira Hancock's book as his source. And it took off. The public loved it. Shelby Foote picked it up for his trilogy. Michael Shara picked it up for Killer Angels. The movie Gettysburg picked it up. Now it's one of the most famous stories of the battle, like one of those overnight sensations that took 100 years. The one person who wouldn't have been surprised is their old friend, Harry Heath. And I'll close with this. I'd never seen this quote used before. Again, Heath's memoirs were published in the 1890s, but he said, "Those 2 regimental associates, messmates, and devoted friends never met again on earth, but I'm sure have met again in heaven. I think Armistead was killed by Hancock's troops, and Hancock was wounded by one of Armistead's command." What a commentary on Civil War. Thank you, folks. Appreciate it. We only had one technical glitch, so that's good for me. Anybody have any questions? I'd be happy to.
So after Armistead is wounded and he's brought over to the Spaniel farm, I know he's put into that separate house.
Yeah. In the summer kitchen, probably. We think, yeah.
The summer kitchen. And wasn't he with, which Union soldier was he with in that house at that time?
Don't know. I didn't. I think the key thing when you're doing this, you have to occasionally say, "I don't know," when you don't know. I didn't do a tremendous amount of research on his time at the Spanish because he was there such a brief period of time. I know when we go to Gettysburg, it's fascinating because he was there. I don't.
I thought was it not Barlow who was there? Or?
Not that I know. May have been. I don't know. Nothing. I tried to pull out every interesting quote that I thought he had, but he wasn't in good shape for part of it. But I didn't research that one. It was only just when you're doing this whole story, it's just a blip in his story. He was there, 48 hours basically.
You said Armistead's son was on his staff.
Yeah.
What, did he go on to, did he stay?
He stayed in the Army. He lost his, well, it wasn't really a commission, but he was no longer going to be on a general staff when his father died. He went back to, his uncles were in the cavalry. He was in the 6th Virginia Cavalry, so he served out. Robert E. Lee, who knew the Armisteads, was going to try to get him into a staff position. He said he wanted to go join the cavalry. Sadly, for history, never wrote about his experiences. Moved to the north after the battle, married a granddaughter of Daniel Webster, lived in New England, and never wrote about his experiences. The question was, did he go forward and pick his charge? There's no account that he did. I think somebody would have said if he did. He was seen with Armistead before the charge. We don't really know. And I think it underscores, we think we know a lot, because generals, we know a lot about these stories. A lot of just the regular foot soldiers, we don't know their stories. They're buried. We'll never know them. They didn't write, or their family didn't save the letters. So it would have really added some richness to this story if he went by Keith, if W. Keith Armistead had written about it, but he never did. Maybe it's one of those things we often hear Those of us who had fathers were in World War II, and they, you know, you don't talk about the war. Maybe that was it. I don't know. He never seemed to, you know, acknowledge that. And it might have been, I'm in the North, I don't want to, you know, be identified as a Confederate anymore. But that's just all conjecture. But it is a fascinating family when you think of it. Yes, sir.
Are there any indications that deal with Armistead putting his hat on his sword?
Yes, described multiple times. The discrepancy is when it happened. Again, you can read any account that you want. It happened right at the beginning. It happened when he crossed the fence. It happened when he crossed the wall. We don't. It seems like it would have been later in the charge, just using common sense. But there is an account that said he did it right away. So, but multiple soldiers wrote about him doing it. So we know it happened. We just don't know exactly when it happened. It ruined it. Did ruin it. Heck of a way to get guys to follow you, though. I guess, you know, in that kind of chaos, that's one of the few things you would follow. But we know it happened. Yes. Thank you very much, folks. Really enjoyed it.
Again, Tom, thank you much. All right, everyone, thank you for joining us this evening. Tom has some of his books in the back, and I think you're willing to do a little signing. That'd be great.
Sure.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate that. And be sure to join us next month. We're going to have Alex Rosino here to talk about his new work, There, Maryland, looking at Confederate forces at the beginning of the Maryland campaign. So again, thank you for being here, everybody, and we will talk to you next month.
You okay with the mic?